Blueprints has been one of this year's breakout puzzle games, and critical reception for it has been very, very positive. In fact, at the time of writing this, Blueprints was actually the top-rated game of the year on Metacritic with a critic score of 92, only just recently being surpassed by the outstanding RPG Clair Obscur Expedition 33. But even still, Blueprints' current score puts it above titles like Kingdom Come: Deliverance II, a game that's been universally praised as one of the most immersive RPGs ever made, and Split Fiction, the latest co-op adventure from one of the industry's most inventive, most well-respected studios. Blueprints is one of those games, though, where the user reviews vary quite a bit more, and more frequently point out some of the game's noticeable flaws that are maybe being overlooked or forgiven in their critic review counterparts. Sitting right around a 7.6, players are still looking upon this game pretty favorably, but pretty favorable is a long way from can't miss experience, which tells us that there's at least some degree of disconnect between game reviewers and the much wider pool consisting of the average player. And I think even more important than an aggregate score is the qualitative information we can gather from player opinions. Because in the case of Blueprints, those opinions span nearly every point on the review spectrum, from an all-time masterpiece of a game to a blueprint for frustration. I've played Blueprints, and I think it's fantastic in many ways. It's fascinating and immersive and polished and beautiful, and when you look at those components in isolation, you can understand the reception it's received as one of the top games of the year. But Blueprints can also be frustrating and needlessly circuitous, and frankly out of touch with its own design concepts, contributing to an artificially drawn-out experience that you ultimately have much less control over than you may initially believe. So in this video, we're going to look at where this disconnect is coming from, how this game was built to excel at many of its goals but struggle with many others, and why Blueprints is the freshest, most carefully designed experience you'll play this year that just doesn't work the way it wants to. The first piece to understanding this puzzle is recognizing what Blueprints is and what it isn't. In simple terms, this is a first-person mystery-solving puzzle roguelike. If that sounds like a pretty unique combination of elements, that's because it is. The developers describe the game as genre-defying, which is maybe a bit of marketing hyperbole, but I can definitely confirm that Blueprints truly is like nothing else I've played before. The premise is centered around exploring an architecturally ambiguous mansion called Mount Holly Estate, which consists of 45 rooms of varying layouts and functions. But your goal is to find the very well-hidden 46th room, and along the way uncover the many mysteries surrounding the manor and its lineage. What makes Mount Holly unique is the fact that there are 45 spaces for rooms, but you determine the layout of the house by choosing which rooms to draft and place in each particular space. Every time you open a new door, you're given the option of 3, mostly randomly selected floor plans that you can choose from, and your choice is placed down in front of you in real time, allowing you to determine how the manor is built as you go. Each room will typically include a unique function and/or some kind of resource or perk. So a guest bedroom will grant you additional steps you can take that day. A parlor always includes a box puzzle that will reward you with gems when solved correctly, and a utility closet allows you to shift power on and off to certain other rooms in the house. But all of these rooms also consist of a predetermined layout and number of entrances and exits. And because you essentially build the mansion in order from room to room, you have to be mindful of these layouts to continually allow yourself to progress without blocking all of your potential paths forward. The reality, though, is that exact situation is going to happen frequently. And in fact, not having a way to keep moving through the mansion, whether that be from running out of keys, exhausting all your steps, or building yourself into a dead end, that's essentially the end condition for all of your runs in Blueprints. And that's where the roguelike elements of the game come into play. Hey, Leap here. Who else? So listen, for the sake of consistency, I'll be using the term roguelike throughout this entire video. If you're someone who still cares about the feudal debate of roguelike versus roguelite, just go ahead and assume they're synonymous here. As we'll discuss at the end of the video, in this case it really doesn't matter either way. Each time you need to call it a day, as the game puts it, you are transported back to the entrance of the mansion on the following day, and every space has been reset, providing you with an entirely blank grid to begin drafting again. So in essence, each day and each run will result in a completely unique path through the house as you continue to explore, find new rooms, and uncover the story's many secrets hidden throughout. This premise and blending of genres is not only incredibly fresh, it's also really smoothly implemented. At least, on the surface. The presentation of Blueprints is outstanding. The amount of polish and care you'll notice in its visual style, its sparse but atmospheric soundtrack, and its clean as hell user interface is a serious achievement. I don't think I've ever been as excited to give recognition for a game's font choices as I am for Blueprints. I'm not kidding. Look how much cooler these item discovery screens look simply because of the treasure hunt-like fonts and animations they used. Meanwhile, the clear uppercase lettering used to label rooms draws direct influence from the type of style used for architectural plans, but that little extra bit of boldness, along with the distinct coloration of each room, makes your house map feel just as much whimsical as it does economical. And the stylish floating script that you glide by as you begin each day makes for the perfect visual transition into every new run. All of these pieces make the flow of exploring Mount Holly Manor a really smooth, really enjoyable experience. Every single room template is stylized in a way to make them easily distinguishable from one another, and as you enter each one, sometimes the game's musical score will remain silent, sometimes you'll be hit with a smooth noir-like oboe melody, and sometimes there's just a soft but noticeable hum that your ears will recognize as the simple ambient soundscapes of a normal home. And as you continue to draft run after roguelike run of this ever-shifting residence, you'll slowly begin to uncover small pieces to the mystery surrounding it. A library request slip found on one day will cause the selected book to show up the next time that room is drafted during a subsequent run. A scribbled-on piece of scrap paper will give you just a sliver of context that could be just the clue you were looking for, or could be something you won't fully grasp until many days later. And occasionally, an eerie fortune-telling sequence will deliver some dialogue that provides the answers to some of your questions, but also likely creates several new ones. This style of slow burn, esoteric mystery solving is very reminiscent of what you'd experience in puzzle game classics like Myst. It gives the player small pieces to the puzzle one at a time, but the full picture and scope of things only becomes truly clear much, much later. And behind all of its many layers, hidden clues, and secret meanings, there is a very cool story going on here. If you're able to commit the time to unravel it, the way in which Blueprints' world slowly gets pieced together is ultimately one of the highlights of the experience. But it's also where some of the cracks in the game's foundation start to show, as you begin to realize that the pace at which you'll be able to resolve its mysterious narrative isn't so much dependent on your own problem-solving abilities and mental acuity, as it is what opportunities the game happens to present to you, and at what times it happens to do so. Blueprints has a progression problem. The essence of most roguelikes is built around systems of progression, allowing the player to gradually but consistently improve aspects of each run to become more powerful or more adept at facing the hazards and barriers they'll face along the way. And randomness is a key component to making these systems work. The general structure of most modern roguelikes is remarkably simple. 3 or 4 distinct biomes containing similar rooms and similar enemies, multiple player-chosen paths through these areas that modify the run slightly, and typically some kind of predetermined boss or final encounter at the end of each region. It's a formula that would not be nearly as compelling and successful if not for the emphasis on character or build variety that is centered around randomness. Roguelikes prevent their formula from becoming stale by ensuring that no 2 runs are ever identical, providing players with a choice of random upgrades, items, weapons, and abilities at a pretty generous rate. So during any individual run, the player progresses their character through these constantly compounding choices, scaling their power level as they go to meet or often exceed that of the barriers they'll face. In addition to that, there is almost always a separate system of permanent progression. Pieces to the overall status of your character that improve and persist between runs. Permanent progression allows the game designer to create scenarios or levels that are too difficult for the player to consistently succeed at, initially. But the more and more runs they play, the more resources they collect, and the more permanent upgrades they acquire, the more reliable their build becomes, and the more consistent they'll be at tackling challenges that once seemed insurmountable. If you've played any number of roguelikes, I'm not explaining anything to you that you don't already know. This is a very candid foundation that the vast majority of these games rely on. Blueprints doesn't take this approach, and at times seems to misunderstand the purposes of both progression and randomness and the value that they can bring to a game like this. Let's take a look at that progression component first. The typical systems of intra-run progression we see in most roguelikes are, for the most part, non-existent in Blueprints. In fact, though there are pieces in place that attempt to increase the adeptness of your character the further you venture into the manor, many times it's almost the opposite scenario that ends up playing out. And, as we'll discover later, these attempts at improving power level are far too reliant on randomness to ever be used as a reliable strategy. So obviously, you don't really get stronger throughout runs in blueprints the way you would in other roguelikes. There are some instances of mechanics that mimic that idea, like drafting a room that grants you additional steps after you draft other rooms of the same color, or occasionally being able to combine some of your items to craft more effective versions of them. But these examples are either pretty rare or ultimately not super impactful anyway. So the main method of progressing through an individual run ends up being the process of collecting more resources. There are several resources the game uses, and unlike some of its attempts at increasing your power level, all of these resources have the potential to make a pretty big impact. Your number of steps are essentially like a stamina counter that determines how much distance you can cover before having to call it a day. Keys obviously unlock locked doors. Gems are used as a requirement to draft certain rooms. Rooms that have better utility and more favorable layouts cost more gems. Dice can be used to re-roll your selection of floor plans you receive when drafting a new room. And lastly, coins are your standard form of currency used to purchase items and other resources when the situation permits. The majority of the time, barring some specific conditions, most of these resources are tough to come by in blueprints. General strategy will have you filling out the rooms in the lower ranks to collect as many resources as you can early on into your run. There's even a document you can find in the house that encourages you to do this. Sometimes this strategy works, sometimes it doesn't. It really just depends on which rooms you're able to draft at that point in the run and whether or not they'll either directly provide more resources or facilitate scenarios that allow you to collect more. It's also very possible to simply block your way out of progressing through the mansion as you snake your way through these lower rooms, even if you're making decisions that are statistically on your side. But let's take the keys as an example of why swapping resource management in the place of reliable progression systems ends up being a bit backwards in a game like Blueprints. Let's say our plan of filling out as many rooms as possible as we make our way north on the house map is panning out as planned. We collect several keys, and we want to get even more, but in order to get more, we need to draft more rooms that are potentially storing them. If you're following along, one of the obvious problems here is that some doors are locked and require a key to open in the first place. One of the many quirks about Mount Holly Manor is that the further north you progress, the more likely it is that doors will be locked. So as we make our way through the middle and top levels of the house, we have to start burning more keys for the chance of finding more keys. There may also be locked trunks scattered throughout the rooms, so if you want to open those, you'll have to use even more of your keys. So on the surface, Blueprints is very much a game where resource management is highly strategic. You can't unlock every door, you can't purchase every item, you can't redraft every room. So picking and choosing which resources you want to use and when is one of the main strategic decisions you're making in the game. But because it doesn't embrace other methods of progression, and, as we'll see later, because of its reliance on randomness as an intentional barrier, the strategy you choose to implement in regards to your resources eventually starts to feel a bit hollow. Remember earlier when I was describing the design of good roguelikes and how they scale your power level to be competitive with that of the barriers you'll face? This is the opposite of what ends up happening in Blueprints. Runs through the mansion almost always feel like they have a predetermined fail state. You know you're inevitably going to reach a point where you're simply consuming more resources than you're acquiring. And that system works fine for a while. But because you're not given reliable methods to manage your resources moving forward, it does get old and understandably frustrating pretty quickly. And if you haven't played the game, I know what you're thinking right now. Of course it's designed like that. You're meant to fail many times. You're meant to run out of resources. In Hades, you probably got your ass kicked by the Bone Hydra the first time you faced it. But eventually, you got better at the game, and you were given methods of permanent progression that guaranteed the fight would get more manageable over time. So surely the developers of Blueprints implemented those same methods of persistent progression to combat this very problem. And in fact, since there's not really any way of getting better at the mechanics of this game after the initial learning curve, surely they compensated for this by doubling down on permanent upgrades and made them even more impactful than they are in other roguelikes, right? If temporary methods of progression in Blueprints are non-existent, permanent methods of progression aren't a whole lot better. They do exist. There are several things the game does to upgrade your ability to traverse the manor between runs, and many of them are actually very clever. There are rooms you can find that will contain an item or a cache of resources in it the next day if you're able to draft that same room on that run. There are areas on the mansion grounds you're able to permanently gain access to that each provide certain perks. I think the coolest example, though, is the upgrade discs you can find throughout the house and upload to a terminal to alter a room format to create a modified version of that room that will be more useful to you. So in general, there is much more genuine effort put into options for persistent upgrades than temporary ones. But the main problem with the persistent progression in blueprints isn't what options it gives you, it's that the frequency with which you actually come across one of these options is exceedingly low. One of the other things that I mentioned about quality roguelikes is that they're typically pretty generous with the amount of opportunities they give you to improve your character. Many of them even give you ways to prioritize these type of upgrades and allow you to focus on farming the materials or resources required to do so if your preferred strategy involves purely beefing up your character as fast as possible. Obviously, that's not really happening in blueprints, and a lot of that is understandable. It's simply not that kind of game and isn't trying to be. But the bigger picture, more important part of this process is that the best roguelikes never make you feel like you're wasting your time. They find ways to make sure that you are gaining something, that you are improving something after every single run. Because Blueprints is so stingy with its permanent upgrades and perks, you'll experience plenty of runs after which you have gained nothing tangible for your efforts. Your character enters the next day at the exact same level of ability that they just were during a failed attempt. And this can feel really bad. Okay, but this game, at its core, is a puzzle game. So it would make sense then that the thing you gain from run to run is actually knowledge. For example, throughout one day of exploration, you may not have been able to solve a particular puzzle, but perhaps you acquired the information and context required to solve it the next time you come across it. And this is the case at certain points throughout the game, either early on when you're first discovering how everything works, or during the rare occasions in larger scope puzzles when you know what you're searching for and are afforded the opportunity to deliberately seek that information out without being restricted by some of the many ways Blueprints attempts to slow you down. But in between those moments of uninhibited detective work, there are long stretches of gameplay that feel more like fighting for every new clue, even if you know exactly what you're looking for. During these moments, there's actually a surprising lack of solvable puzzles present. And I say solvable because a lot of the really interesting, complexly woven puzzles that Blueprints does a great job with won't be consistently accessible until much later into your playthrough, when you're able to explore the manner with a little more autonomy than you're given in the early and middle stages of the game. So a very large amount of time in your playthrough is going to be spent collecting information you can't use yet, or you don't know the use for because you haven't happened to stumble across where and how it's implemented. Or, the case that's really a problem, you do know the use for it, but you can't get back to the place you need to be without several subsequent failed runs of trial and error. What's really going on is the game takes a handful of major puzzle interactions and restricts progress towards their solutions behind its roguelike structure. In other words, it uses a format that requires you to conduct run after run in order to space out the time it takes to get from problem to solution. I would look at this as like the density of puzzle solving content here. There are a ton of clues hidden all throughout Mount Holly Manor, but the volume of puzzle solving you'll be doing in relation to the amount of time you'll need to invest in the game is surprisingly low. I know that's going to sound crazy to a lot of people who have played this game thoroughly, but think of it this way. If you took all of the rooms in Blueprints and kept every puzzle, every clue, every piece of information, but you organized those rooms in a permanent, structured way, in an environment that did not reset each day, in a setting in which your only barrier to accessing that information was how efficient you were at solving each puzzle, how long do you think it would take you to complete this game? And by the way, I don't think this hypothetical is the solution to the game's problems. We've seen and played plenty of traditional exploration puzzle games that utilize that format. And part of the appeal of Blueprints is that it breaks that mold. But it does demonstrate the point that the game's roguelike nature takes the content that does exist and it stretches it out over a much longer period of time than normal. The other piece of this problem is that a very large amount of the clues and context you'll gather from run to run are not pertinent to the game's stated main objective. There is a ton of optional content in Blueprints that comes with a ton of optional information, but the player has no way of knowing which of those pieces of information are required to progress. So even if you uncover or learn something new with every run, it's not necessarily something that will be useful to you on your next run, or possibly ever. So what does all that have to do with a failure to implement well-designed systems of persistent progression? Well, because that higher puzzle-solving density just isn't there, it also means that the game can't consistently feed you new, pertinent information and new applicable knowledge as a form of progression, at least not at a rate that feels satisfying to the player. In Blueprints, there are certainly a handful of tricky scenarios to work through, but the thing that most often prevents you from solving a particular puzzle is not that you don't know how or that you can't figure it out, it's that your opportunities to implement what you've learned are locked behind a roguelike format that artificially draws that process out. In fact, this interaction between information and execution is the primary mechanic the game uses to manufacture content. It's the core structure that its entire experience relies upon. And as soon as you become aware of this, it's amplified even more by the fact that for a large portion of your time with the game, whether or not these opportunities present themselves is very, very dependent on luck. Because Blueprints unfortunately doesn't just have a progression problem, it also has a randomness problem. I want to give you an example of a real scenario in Blueprints to demonstrate how its mechanics, its rooms, and its items interact with one another. So occasionally in certain rooms scattered about the manor, you'll find little piles of dirt called dig spots. If you have the shovel in your inventory that day, these sites can be dug up for the chance of uncovering useful items like coins or keys. The shovel can sometimes be found just lying around in different rooms, or sometimes it will appear in the commissary for a price. Sometimes you'll see the shovel in the commissary but won't have enough coins to purchase it. Sometimes you won't come across the item at all. Now there's also a room called the root cellar, and the perk of that room is that it increases the number of dig spots you'll find throughout the house, which of course has the potential to increase the number of resources you might collect during that run. So let's say I've come across the opportunity to draft the root cellar, and I make the deliberate decision to select it instead of two other rooms that would also give me different perks. With the root cellar drafted, I know I'll be finding a significant number of dig sites that day. It's a lot more than normal. But in order to make use of those dig sites, I still need a shovel, and the chances of me happening to stumble upon a shovel and being able to acquire it in any one particular run is far from a guarantee. And even with these sparse situational options you have to sort of manipulate items and rooms at times, there's just no way to ensure that I'll actually acquire the shovel, and therefore also no way to ensure that my decision to create more dig sites can ever be utilized. I could theoretically wait for a run in which I do find a shovel, and if I happen to draft a coat check room during that run, which is also not a guarantee, I could check the shovel there to save it for a future run. But then I'd have to wait for a run in which the root cellar shows up as an option again, and then hope that the coat check also shows up as an option at some point during that run so that I can retrieve the shovel. Ideally pretty early on into the run and in a viable location that doesn't limit my path of movement through the house. This is a very specific example, but the reason it's very specific is because that's how potential interactions between decisions are built in Blueprints. And I promise you there are plenty more just like it that you'll come across during your time with the game. They are all very dependent on RNG, they rely on way too many moving parts largely outside of your control, and even if they do work, there is no way of knowing whether or not they'll be useful since you don't know what the rest of your run will entail. You're essentially attempting to bank on a future scenario that you have no guarantee of ever happening. It's strategically inefficient, it's almost always statistically the incorrect choice, but most importantly, it's super frustrating because the pieces are in place for you to be able to see how cool the plan could be if it worked out. And this is one of the most disappointing things about Blueprints. Its ideas are genuinely exciting. It presents scenarios that are brimming with potential, and when they work, feel really satisfying. And then it puts a maze of barriers in your way before you can see them come to fruition. There are a lot of potential interactions in this game that are inventive and interesting and would be a lot of fun to experiment with, and the game just does everything in its power to make sure that rarely ever happens. It's truly bizarre to design a game that has all the components necessary for creative, almost emergent gameplay, and to spend time building all of those components and crafting specific interactions between them, only to just squander that potential by implementing these scenarios in a way that makes sure the majority of players are going to experience them a handful of times throughout their entire playthrough. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated situation. This is the way that randomness is implemented in this game. It is viewed as a mechanic that can be used to get in the player's way. It's something that the player has to overcome. And I think that's just a fundamental misidentification of why random elements typically work really well in roguelikes. They function as a way to inject variety into the gameplay, often in unexpected or unusual or even unbalanced ways. And yeah, sometimes you can get unlucky. You can draw a card that's useless to you. You can be given a boon that doesn't synergize with any of your other abilities. You can take a chance on a risk or reward dice roll that doesn't go your way. But these elements of randomness and bad luck don't prevent you from moving forward. They may just make it a little more difficult to do so. You're not finding patterns and methods to overcome the random elements as you are in blueprints. You're working with them even if they're not the scenario you had in mind. And randomness in other roguelikes, even if it puts you in a bad spot, certainly never directly ends your run for you, which unfortunately is something that can happen in blueprints much more frequently than it ever should. So the game's main mechanic, the drafting of different rooms to create your path forward, it's a really creative twist on the roguelike formula. And I want to be clear that this is not the same thing as selecting which path you want to take in Slay the Spire, or choosing your next encounter based on its reward like in Hades. Blueprints' drafting mechanic plays out entirely differently than those games. But it also is its own worst enemy, because the way it's executed often locks the player into situations they can't get themselves out of. And even that aspect alone I think is probably fine, but the game also doesn't offer the opportunity for creative solutions to find a way around those situations. And it's in those times when its room drafting premise really falls apart. As I mentioned earlier, each floor plan in Blueprints has both a predetermined layout and most times some type of unique feature or perk assigned to it. As you'll learn pretty early on though, if you start just selecting rooms based on cool perks rather than layouts, you'll quickly draft yourself into a dead end. It doesn't matter how many keys you have, what useful items you've gathered, when there are no more doors to go through, your run is over. That means that a majority of the time, you're prioritizing rooms with favorable layouts that align with your current path. Because yeah, a walk-in closet that guarantees you 4 items can be incredibly helpful, but it's also a closet, and therefore there are no exits out of it. When this system is flowing well, when the game is by chance giving you interesting and balanced selections of room templates, this process feels really good. During those times, there is always a sense of reaping the benefits of one option at the risk of losing out on the other. It forces you to make difficult but satisfying decisions. It can make you think harder about what other rooms you've already drafted and how they might interact with each new one. But then there are times when this system just completely fails. I don't know how else to put it. I don't mean it fails like, oh, that style of design wasn't fun. I mean, it collapses. It can literally end your run even when you are making thoughtful, purposeful, favorable decisions. You can be in the middle of a run with 2 viable open pathways forward on completely different ends of the house, and it is very possible for you to be given a selection of rooms with all 3 options that result in dead ends. Both times. One of the reasons this can happen is that you may be given the option of a room that would create a path forward, but that particular template requires gems to draft, and you just don't have as many of them as you need, so you can't draft that room. It can also happen when you're given a room with a viable path that you can afford, but then you draft and enter that room, and the only door out of it is by chance a special security door that you don't have a keycard for. This is made more frustrating than it needs to be because once you choose to open a door, you are locked into drafting the connecting room at that moment. That's a very important distinction because it is not that the room options are locked and you can come back and make your selection later. You have to make your decision when you choose to open the door. So you'll run into situations in which you're given 3 options for rooms. 2 are dead ends that will automatically end your run, and the third would create a new path forward for you, but you don't have enough gems to draft it. Now you may have enough coins to backtrack and purchase the necessary gems to draft the only viable room, but you're just not given the option to do that, and instead, your run is over. This is an incredibly weird decision because the game already has a built-in system that punishes you for backtracking in its step counter. So it's not like you'd be getting to make this choice with no consequences. But instead, you're just not given the option to make the choice altogether. And the idea that you should be strategizing to anticipate these situations and therefore be prepared for them is a non-argument. It's simply not how the game works. There is so much randomness and so little control over the ultimate path through your run, it is impossible to be prepared for every situation. Take the example I just gave you, for instance. You could argue that I should have already used my coins to purchase more gems so that I'd have them on hand just in case I run into a situation like this. But what if I do that and then the room option I'm given isn't one that requires gems, but it is one that contains a locked door, and I don't have any keys? Well now, since I spent my coins on gems in an anticipatory act of genius, I don't have enough left to go back and purchase a key to open the new door. Instead, my run is over. So even in potentially bad situations you do anticipate, there's no way to guarantee that you'll be able to acquire the solution to the barrier before you get there. You really can just get unlucky, and you will, frequently. And again, this sounds like a specific situation, but I can't stress enough how many types of interactions like this there are present throughout Blueprints. And here's the thing, almost all of them technically have a solution. There are special items that can be used to open certain doors. There are rooms you can find to exchange one resource for another. There are occasionally ways you can rotate rooms when drafting to give you a more favorable path. There are even patterns that you can pick up on regarding where a certain room is more likely to show up on your draft pool. But because of the way the game approaches randomness, the chances you'll be able to access these solutions when you actually need them is very, very rare. And I don't think that's good game design. I don't think we should accept the presence of solutions as a legitimate excuse for these problems when the application of them is often out of the player's control. Eventually, much later on into your playthrough, by way of the very slow accumulation of upgraded rooms and perks, you will be able to take advantage of some strategies, like the aforementioned root cellar interaction, that do make it feel like you have more genuine control and a greater ability to combat the game's random components. But by the time you get to this point, you're kind of so tired of just running through the same rooms in the same way that what should be an engaging new wrinkle into your run feels more like just a method to deal with repetitiveness more effectively. Keep in mind that this is not a game where there's varied, constantly changing combat to keep you engaged. It's not a game where you can tailor your own build to try different strategies. This is a collection of largely static rooms with very few interactive components, most of which you will see over and over again. So despite giving the illusion of every run being different, eventually every run does not feel different. And these would be exciting moments, like crafting an electric power shovel to unearth 40 piles of potential treasure, are either way too rare or come way too late in the process to feel as satisfying as they should. And although you'll likely have at least some additional tools at your disposal to avoid those dead-end scenarios during later game runs, it definitely can still happen. And at that point in the game, when you're likely seeking out a specific room or set of rooms to execute a puzzle solution, this scenario becomes incredibly frustrating, because you've put in your time, you've been patient with the game's structure, you've collected all the information you need, and you just want to move on with the actual puzzle. But then you're forced to restart your run and try again the next day. In the best roguelikes, randomness is a feature that is leveraged to make the game more enjoyable the majority of times it's introduced. In Blueprints, randomness feels more like a barrier to player enjoyment, and is far too often used in a way that not only prevents the player from succeeding, it actively eliminates creative decision-making and strategic thought in a game that hinges on those factors for consistently enjoyable gameplay. Okay, so yes, Blueprints struggles at times with its structure and its respect for the player's time, but there are solutions to this. So for the sake of being actually constructive, here's a handful of specific changes that I think would drastically improve the experience of the game by minimizing frustration, increasing reliable gameplay strategies, and better rewarding player exploration. Number 1. Implement a more reliable method for drafting specific rooms. Throughout the beginning hours of Blueprints, as you're constantly discovering new floor plans and interactions, the randomness applied to drafting rooms is a lot of fun. But as you progress through the game and reach new knowledge thresholds, you'll often be seeking out a specific room or combination of rooms in order to solve a puzzle. Now, we don't want to eliminate the random component of this process. It's what the entire structure of the game is built on. But over time, at a consistent pace, it would be nice to make this process more reliable. Simply ramping up the likelihood of discovering dice, and in turn increasing the player's ability to redraft floor plans, would go a long way here. The game may already do this behind the scenes with dice and other resources, but if it does, it's pretty negligible and would benefit greatly from being tuned up. Adding scenarios that add a fourth option to the drafting pool also feels like a no-brainer here. In fact, making this a discoverable, permanent addition would make this an awesome, impactful incentive that could help to inject a bit of excitement into players who have become disgruntled with the drafting process over time. Keep in mind, permanent upgrades are not easy to come by in Blueprints. They require a lot of thought and problem solving, and they're one of the more satisfying pieces of the game. So making the player work for this change, but in return giving them a bit more of a chance to draft a favorable room, is a nice way to improve quality of life during the later stages of the game. Number 2. Not having the unique items you need when you need them ultimately becomes a pretty big frustration as you continue to explore Mount Holly Manor. Similar to improving the process of drafting rooms as you get further into the game, Blueprints desperately needs more reliable ways to acquire specific items. I think the number of items offered by the commissary each day should be increased, probably doubled. The barrier to acquiring items through the commissary is that they cost money to buy, so the added inconvenience of having a small selection of random items feels like a needless choice. You can even increase the cost of certain items if you want to prevent players from just stockpiling everything they can. The important part is that the player has the increased choice and autonomy to acquire the things they're looking for, rather than just hoping those items will be in stock that day. Another option for a commissary change would be to have items that you have crafted in previous runs appear for purchase. Maybe in that case, there's a special shelf that allows for only one crafted item each day to keep them slightly more rare. The coat check is a really cool idea for a room that makes an honest but ultimately clumsy attempt to help players carry progress through subsequent runs. There are two routes I think you could take with this one. The first is to allow players to check more than one item at a time, but make each one after the first cost an increasing amount of coins to do so. This way, if your run leads you to an unexpected route or puzzle, you have a slightly more reliable way of retrieving the item that would help you with that scenario, rather than being locked into the one item you happened to check on a previous day. The second option would be to keep the coat check operating as it currently does, but remove it as an independent room, and instead add it again as a permanent upgrade that is attached to the entrance hall. This, at the very least, ensures that you will always have access to at least one item you think might be useful to you in the future, and eliminates the need to go hunting for a chance to draft the coat check room. As a minor bonus, it would also remove one of the current dead-end floor plans from the room pool. Number 3. Give us more upgrade discs. Of all of the features and blueprints, of all of the potential options for impactful progression, the upgrade discs feel like the biggest wasted opportunity in the game. These things are really cool. They essentially allow you to permanently change the perks of individual rooms, oftentimes giving you one or two safe options that simply make the room more rewarding, along with a more off-the-wall option that can completely change the way you interact with the room. Upgraded rooms can be extremely useful for collecting more resources, and in fact act as a built-in method for slowly increasing the number of resources you'll gain the more and more you play, which is exactly what this game needs. But the other thing that makes upgrade discs such a cool feature is that they are one of the only components of the game that you can customize to your individual preferences or playstyle. So, if you get the opportunity to upgrade your closet, for example, you can take the reliably useful option to add one additional item to the room each time you draft it in a hallway. Or you can be a bad boy and take the risk of adding 4 additional items, but only when you draft it adjacent to a red room. Does this screw you out of gaining utility from the closet in most situations? Or does it add utility to a series of rooms that will typically punish you in some way? The answer is that it screws you, but it was my choice to get screwed. Unlike other roguelikes, Blueprints does not have different builds. It does not allow you to experiment with different loadouts or upgrade paths that are tailored to your preferences. So yes, there is obviously a massive RNG component to the game, but every single player is essentially experiencing that randomness in the same way. Upgrade discs change this, or at least they have the potential to change it. Unfortunately, like most systems of progression in the game, the number of times you'll actually come across one of these discs is very, very low. And this just feels like a huge mistake to me. Let me trick the fuck out of my house. Let me turn this game into MTV Cribs Mount Holly Manor Edition. Making player-specific choices that alter the functions of rooms not only adds a level of personalization to your playthrough, it also provides an oddly compelling sense of ownership of the house. No longer is this place just a random collection of rooms that your great uncle conjured up. It's a random collection of your rooms, the way you want them to be. It's also just really exciting when you come across one of these discs. So if I knew I had a decent chance of finding them on subsequent runs, it would have gone a long way in keeping me motivated to continue playing the game during all those times when it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. Of all the changes that could lead to a better experience, this is the one that should have gotten more attention because it simultaneously contributes to solving several of the game's problems. It makes resource management more enjoyable by slowly but consistently increasing the number of resources you gather. It gives rooms more utility, so it doesn't feel as bad when you have to draft a room that isn't ideal for your desired path or goals. It provides a reliable source of permanent progression that builds player power one room at a time. And it injects a level of excitement and customization to periods of the game that can begin to feel stale. Currently, only a fraction of the floor plans in Blueprints can be upgraded, which is a shame, because if more development time was put into substantially increasing that number, it would have absolutely transformed this game. Okay, are y'all ready for the big twist of this video? I still think this game is very, very good, a lot of the time. If you persist through it, if you're willing to put in the time it takes to get to some of its late game and optional areas and scenarios, things can get really enjoyable. Blueprints takes an extremely creative approach to puzzle solving. It implements this practice at both small and large scale, and it uses it as a way to make the player even more interested in the world and story in a very effective manner. The inventive and thoughtful approach that went into the structuring of these puzzles, these rooms, these clues, it's consistently impressive. And there is so much to discover, from major plot points to the smallest of Easter eggs. You can spend hours getting lost in blueprints trying to find everything, and I'm definitely one of the players who became fixated on doing that at different points. Despite my better judgment, I've sunk a lot of time into this game. The reason I've spent the last 40 minutes criticizing Blueprints' pretty noticeable problems is because I think it's just very clear that they don't need to be there. They feel like unnecessary evils that don't add anything to the game and could have very easily been fixed in most cases. And the ways that Blueprints struggles with both progression and RNG feed into and fuel a broader issue with pacing and momentum. Which means not only can the short-term gameplay become frustrating at any given moment, but the long-term flow of the game is in a constant state of uncertainty. Let me explain. So I mentioned earlier that Blueprints' puzzle solving is stretched out in a way due to its roguelike format. What I've learned though is that many people have found this slow pace at which you'll gain access to clues and solutions to be a good fit for the way they progressed through the game. Unlike my experience, they've typically felt that they did usually gain something valuable from each run, and that the game didn't waste their time in that aspect because there was always some piece of information for them to capture, even if it didn't feel like they were truly making progress. And in some ways, that is true. Outside of an occasional just busted run, there is almost always something to work towards, something to experiment with, something to look into. If you don't mind the game often dictating what those things are and when you're going to do them, you will likely be consistently compelled by Blueprints' structure and the way it controls the efficiency of your experience. In contrast, if you see yourself getting irritated by having an idea but not being able to put it into motion, this is going to frustrate you. Now, to be fair, even when the game is dictating your course of action, there are still moments when you are regularly discovering new things on these paths that it sets you out on. When that happens, when the pace of the game feels like it was built to feed you just enough to keep going, it's exciting and fun and feels like you're moving along without even noticing time go by. But again, for every time that happens, there are just as many moments that are muddy and trudging and, at their worst, uninteresting. It's this process of constantly alternating through opposite experiences that makes Blueprints' flow of gameplay feel extremely uneven. At any given point, it could provide you with the exact sense of momentum and accomplishment that you want out of it before returning to periods of painful repetition and unfavorable RNG. You'll climb to a peak of deftly maneuvering through the game's systems on your way to discovering new and exciting things before falling into a valley where those same systems actively prevent you from maintaining any control over your experience. This unevenness happens many times on your way to Room 46, and many times after that still. So it's completely understandable that even players who roll credits on this game will feel a lack of motivation to continue on after that, knowing that they'll still have to fight through the game's repetitive and poorly thought out systems. Because although this process plays out differently throughout the early, mid, and late game, it is persistent across all three nonetheless. In the early game, it banks on the fact that the novelty of its mechanics and the thrill of discovery will carry you through the experience during a time in which you will frequently be starting over. This is mostly true. Then it banks on the fact that by the time you reach the end game, you'll have enough at your disposal to consistently make progress with some of its bigger puzzles. This is sometimes true, but it seems to neglect the entirety of the mid-game, the exact point where players are most likely to get frustrated with these systems. Most people I've found who really enjoy Blueprints don't deny that its elements of randomness can get in your way. This part of the game does exist, and it does function the way I've described it. The counterargument seems to be more about perspective and embracing what the game throws at you. One of the main pieces of advice that proponents of Blueprints provide is to focus less on the end goal and focus more on exploration and gathering information. And this is without a doubt good advice. I fully agree with this mindset. If you try to cruise through this game with the intention of quickly reaching its conclusion, you're probably approaching it the wrong way. And it has probably been a fair assumption to hear my criticism of this game and assume that I too was simply approaching it the wrong way. But I promise you that was not the case. And in fact, I adopted the same information-focused playstyle very early on into my experience with blueprints. I didn't care about reaching the end, or accessing the antechamber, or finding the 46th room. I intentionally selected rooms that I knew would lead me to a dead end if they were templates I had not yet seen and explored. I wasted steps backtracking if it meant I could experiment with some of the interactions between different spaces. And despite all of this, I was still frequently frustrated by the structure that was chosen for this game. There was a point very far into my time with the game during which I had 5 different leads I wanted to investigate, all involving different floor plans. Now, going into each new run, I was completely flexible in my mindset as to which of these leads I'd be exploring further. I was not zeroed in on having to get the answers for one or the other right away. I was prepared for each scenario, but also open to letting the randomness of the game determine which path I'd be taking that day. But as with most puzzles and blueprints, these tasks were not just a matter of finding a particular room. There's a very specific set of circumstances surrounding each one that needs to occur in order to progress with it. And even this late into my playthrough, we're talking dozens and dozens of hours, even with upgrades and special items and a thorough understanding of how the house and its rooms work, there was nothing I could do but try and try again over the course of many runs and just hope that I'd get lucky with certain combinations of results. So despite knowing exactly what I wanted to do with each of these rooms, and despite putting hours into the game to progress to a point where I had access to more resources and more strategies, there was still no reliable way to take that line from problem to solution and make it any shorter. This is the part where measuring individual experiences gets pretty interesting, because in this case, when comparing what I played to someone who was not bothered by this, we both generally experienced the same thing. Even in a game where randomness plays a significant role on a local level, over the entire course of our playthroughs, we both got lucky sometimes and got unlucky other times. It's highly unlikely that all of the players who feel really positive about the game just happen to get better RNG. That's just not how statistics work. But as always, it's the reaction and response to those situations that result in differing opinions of the experience. For me, I didn't think that a nugget of information here or an obtusely presented clue there provided enough of a sense of progression to feel motivated to restart run after run. And to be clear, if you're in this game for the long haul, there will be plenty of runs in which you're not even getting that much. On top of that, there are more tangible ways to provide a sense of progression that are already built into the game and are just confusingly underutilized. Again, it's also important to point out that a large proportion of the knowledge you pick up from run to run are things that are not related to the main quest in blueprints. They are pieces of extra content and additional puzzles that you can choose to do if you want to understand the full story behind this world. But since you don't necessarily know which clues are pertinent to you and which aren't, you may feel like you've gained a new piece of information every single run, but you may never end up using that information. So is this type of blurry, contextual, slow drip really a valuable use of the player's time? That's not a rhetorical question. The answer for you could be absolutely yes. For me, it was a clear no. And this feels like one of the biggest missteps taken by blueprints, because the majority of its more complex, thoughtfully planned puzzle scenarios are most likely to come after the credits roll. You may have happened to come across and solve one or two pieces of them on your way there, but none are required to reach your initial objective. So a lot of those highs the game provides in its late game sections aren't going to be accessible to a whole lot of players who have decided to call it quits after reaching room 46 or well before. And even if you are someone who chooses to continue on to see what else Mount Holly has to offer, those highs are still staggered by the same aggravating lows the game creates the entire way through. Obviously, Blueprints' mentality towards RNG-based mechanics plays a large role in this, which would mean that in many cases, the existence of those mechanics, and maybe more accurately, the degree to which they're implemented, doesn't seem to have a large impact on other players' experiences. But if you're one of those players, the one simple question I would ask you is, would your experience with the game have been worse if there was less randomness present? I could be wrong, and I mean, maybe this just sounds really arrogant to say, but I cannot imagine anybody answering yes to that question. This is not like a should Dark Souls have an easy mode argument, where oftentimes the feeling of satisfaction for many players is inherently fused with the difficulty of the game. In Blueprints, more thoughtful progression and a better understanding of how to utilize randomness are not an easy mode for this game or games like it. You still have to be very observant. You still have to be very intentional with your actions. You still have to simply take the time to think. And that's great. That's wonderful. That's part of the magic of Blueprints. But when there are so many times it feels like the game deliberately creates barriers to that magic, that detracts from what should be an unparalleled gaming experience. There's an interesting piece to this discussion that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is what we know about the history of this game's development and what exactly it was intended to be. Now, you've heard me and many others describe Blueprints as a roguelike puzzle game, but you won't find the term roguelike or roguelite anywhere on official descriptions of or marketing for the game. And in fact, on the independent website of Tonda Ross, the visionary and lead designer behind Blueprints, it's described simply as an atmospheric first-person strategy game. Now, I'm not usually one who gets caught up in labels and genre titles and all that. I think most people get way too fixated on those things when describing a game, but there's a reason it's interesting in this particular case. The lack of the roguelike descriptor is peculiar. Not just because it attempts to steer away from a pretty clear genre fit, but also because, considering the popularity of that genre right now, normally developers would be happy to add that tag in there in hopes of attracting a larger player base, especially for a game that already targets a bit of a niche audience by nature of being a puzzle game. But in interviews leading up to and after Blueprints' release, Tonda Ross has revealed that he never had any intention of making the game a roguelike, or at least he didn't realize that's what he was doing. In fact, the initial concept for Blueprints was inspired more by board games and their structure than it was by popular roguelike video games. And you can see this influence. The drafting mechanic is a literal, architectural take on the card drafting found in many board and tabletop games. But Ross has also implied that the complexity of the story and physical space in Blueprints could only be possible in a video game. And from reading and watching these interviews, it's clear that he's very hesitant about steering anywhere near that roguelike comparison, despite the fact that what he has created, intentionally or not, shares pretty much every defining component with that style of game. It's a special one, it's a really fresh twist on one, and it blends in pieces from several other genres, but even still, it actually very cleanly fits into the roguelike category of games. So if I don't personally care about labels like this, why is it important in this case, from a perspective of critiquing the design of Blueprints? Well, the impression you get from Ross's interviews, and in fact, he explicitly states this himself at times, is that he designed and developed this game with almost a sort of intentional ignorance towards what this entire genre was about. He was not interested in playing, analyzing, or unfortunately learning from other roguelike games because he didn't want it to limit the scope of what was available to him. And while I can totally understand this aspect of his creative process, and even relate to it in ways, that's disappointing to hear, because there is so much that could have been implemented to alleviate a lot of the issues in Blueprints had that readily available information been sought out. But it does certainly give us some insight into why this game is the way it is. In fact, there's a lot of telling bits of information and quotes in these interviews that I think actually go a long way to explain some of these bizarrely overlooked mechanics, systems, and features that many other games have smoothed out over the years. For example, Ross also comments on the way that other puzzle games implement frictionless puzzle systems, something that a player is exposed to and the game maybe guides them to the solution in one way or another, often because completing that particular puzzle at that particular time is what's required to continue progressing. There's nothing wrong with these types of puzzles, of course, and depending on the structure of your game, that might be the preferred implementation. But Ross says that he personally enjoys things you can't solve right away, and in particular, have to ponder for a long time. I do too, in certain cases, because it's these types of puzzles that have the potential to not just make the player feel really clever, but also to provide the payoff of feeling like you really put in the work to get to the solution. And Blueprints does have plenty of puzzles that you have to think about for a long time, but it also has puzzles that force you to wait for a long time. And there's a big difference between pondering and waiting. There are many scenarios in blueprints that require information collecting and understanding over many, many days. That's not the problem here. The problem is the structure and style of the game all but ensure that it will obstruct your ability to carry out that information collecting during those days. And that's a direct result of the game's loop-based gameplay and its random drafting mechanics, combined with its unwillingness to provide reliable methods of progression. So without a doubt, Ross created the game he intended to create, but he did it with no concessions. He made a conscious decision to avoid the experiences, successes, and pitfalls of other game designers within a similar space. Popular examples of these games were around long before Blueprints was even conceived, and they certainly were around when they were blowing things up in the gaming industry during the last 8 years while this title was being developed. And when it comes to critiquing the design of the game, I think it's completely valid to ask the question, was that type of hyper-focused, isolated mindset detrimental to the finished product? Maybe that's impossible to know without true insight into the development of the game, but it's also really hard to ignore the links and the correlations and the fact that the solution to many of the game's problems are generally simple and widely understood by the community. It doesn't matter what you label this game as. It doesn't matter what you call it. I don't care about that at all. Think of any game that utilizes deliberate progression systems, RNG, and some kind of loop or reset mechanic consisting of individual runs. A lot of times we call those roguelikes, sometimes we don't. That's not the point. The point is that the design elements present here have been in a constant state of refinement, particularly over the last decade or so. And that process, that history, has resulted in evolutions and improvements and an understanding of what makes these elements feel good for the player. For better or for worse, Blueprints was just never interested in being a part of this broader process. It wasn't designed to take that into account. Maybe what's somewhat ironic is the success the game has seen and the influence it will undoubtedly have on other titles going forward will certainly make it a part of that broader conversation in the future. This video has been pretty critical of Blueprints, and in particular some of the very core design decisions made in its attempts to fold itself into the roguelike genre. But before going into all of that, I also mentioned that I think this game is fantastic in a lot of ways. I think Blueprints is a great adventure. I think it presents a great mystery. I think at times it can be a great puzzle game. In fact, at times it can be an outstanding puzzle game that will deliver some classic holy shit moments as you piece together some of its more complex inner wiring. But I don't think Blueprints is a very good roguelike, and I don't think there was enough thought put into how the elements it shares with that genre of games would be integrated into its puzzle-solving gameplay. If you are at all interested in the design of games, in the ways developers create systems in their games, in how those systems interact with one another, I think you should absolutely check out Blueprints, even if you never end up finishing it. If you're someone who really enjoys puzzle games with complexly woven mysteries, and you don't mind investing a lot of time due to both the game's structure and the sheer amount of information you'll need to keep track of, you'll probably really love Blueprints. If you're someone who's just looking for an enjoyable time in an interesting setting, I think many people will still get that here too. But many others will find that Blueprints only provides that for a while before its flaws begin to detract from the experience. And unfortunately, by the time you reach some of its more interesting interwoven components, the novel parts of the game have long since lost their luster. I know part of the reason I'm so critical towards this game is because it's very easy to recognize the potential it has. And I see this exact point echoed in the thoughts and experiences of many others. There are so many redeeming features about Blueprints that are genuinely wonderful, but are also stubbornly hidden behind its repetitive and inflexible mechanics. So I find myself almost resenting the game in a way, wishing it would have taken an approach that embraced its roguelike format rather than using it as a tool to prolong and convolute its mysteries. Because I love games like this, and I want as many people as possible to experience this one to its fullest, but I also know in its current state, that isn't happening. The truth is, there is a great story here that is cleverly weaved together and cinematically presented, but the majority of the game's players will never end up reaching its conclusion, let alone anything after that. For me, Blueprints was an initially enchanting adventure that ultimately became bogged down and dragged out by its tendency to manufacture unnecessary playtime. And although I'm glad I pushed through those phases, as they eventually led to some truly memorable puzzle-solving moments with some truly complex pieces, I don't think those moments quite justify the sometimes arduous effort it takes to get there. The overall mystery, tone, and narrative of the game are really engaging, particularly during some of the later segments. And all of that is elegantly wrapped in a style and presentation that is at the top of its game. But those segments should have been a much bigger focus of this game, and frankly should have appeared much sooner into its runtime. By misidentifying what makes a roguelike fun in the first place, and either neglecting or fumbling its elements of progression, randomness, and pacing, Blueprints is a game that ultimately feels mishandled. It will certainly initially hook you with its world of intrigue and its inventive blend of genres, and those same features may reel you back in during other parts of the game like they did for me. But I'd wager that eventually, most players will reach a point in their playthrough where they just want to move forward. And Blueprints just isn't willing to allow you to do that. It is unapologetic in both its design and its execution. And unapologetic is a word that is often used to explain away faults or justify flaws. It almost implies a certain level of respect or even reverence in some cases. But it's not a word that is inherently or comprehensively positive. And Blueprints is a striking example of a project that exemplifies the duality of that term. I actually planned out and even wrote a lot of this script after only putting about half the hours into the game as I currently have. For various reasons, I decided not to go through with that as a final script for the video. And I'm glad I didn't, because there has been so much that I have discovered since then. There have been many fascinating high points that I had yet to experience after my initial reflection on the game. But guess what? Waiting that time and playing more of the game also confirmed quite literally every single criticism I had of it as well. If you're bothered by the things Blueprints throws at you in the first 10 hours, you're still going to be bothered after 60 hours, because it's still going to throw those same things at you. Ultimately, this is a game built on a seemingly fluid structure that promises the player the ability to draft their own path however they choose to solve the mysteries of Mount Holly. And solving those mysteries can be an exhilarating experience. But in the end, much of its mechanical potential turns out to be a well-crafted facade covering a foundation that is not so much flexible as it is shaky. The highs and lows it provides almost automatically make Blueprints one of the most interesting games of this year. But players are still very much divided on whether or not it's one of the best.